Hello to my REST API tutorial using the modern JavaScript principles, and we'll be building this REST API using Express.js, MongoDB and NodeJS, and this is TheSkinnyCoder for you. Okay, so before diving deep into this course, I would like to mention some prerequisites for this. You should know the modern JavaScript principles like ES6 modules, async await, exception handling, etc. And I assume you have Node.js and a package manager like NPM or Yarn installed. It also won't harm you if you know the differences between SQL and NoSQL databases and at least what a database is in general. And I highly advise you to learn about HTTP, the different CRUD operations, and what is a REST API or an API, and how do we use JSON or XML for data transfer. With these, I also assume you have Node.js installed. For that, you go to nodejs.org and you switch to the Downloads tab, and you can select your operating system over here and install it. If you want to follow along exactly the same way as I do, then you gotta go to classic.yarnpackage.com and you can select your operating system over here and you can install it. And we'll be using the cloud MongoDB Atlas as our database. You can also install MongoDB as a local database on your machine, but I'll be using the Atlas version of it, and from scratch I'll be showing the setup of this in this tutorial. And finally, I'll be using Visual Studio Code as my code editor. Feel free to use any other editor like Sublime or Atom, and you can download it from here, code.visualstudio.com. Okay, so there are a couple of extensions too that I'll be showing in Visual Studio Code itself as the tutorial goes on. And now that you know the tools that we'll be using, let's dive in. Okay, so I'm on my desktop over here, and let me open Windows Terminal. And I think that opened on the other monitor, and say hi to Darth Vader. I'm using PowerShell and I'm on Windows operating system. So let me switch to my desktop, okay, and create a todos app directory and cd into it, and I'll open Visual Studio Code in that, and that again open another desktop, and I'll be pulling that over here. Very good. So let me toggle the terminal. For terminal, I'll go here and use the new terminal thing, or control-tilde-should-22. It'll open the terminal for me. And as a first step, we'll have to initialize our basic and an empty npm repository in this folder. So I'll do npm init -y to accept all the defaults that we'll be getting. And you see we have generated a package.json file. Okay, and I'll name this as todos app server, and forget the description. And the entry point file or the main file will be server.js. We'll get into scripts later, and it's a personal preference to use MIT as my license. Okay, we'll also create a server.js file, and let me log hello world as of now. And to use ES6 modules, we'll have to specify the type over here to module, and CommonJS will be that require syntax that you'll be seeing in most tutorials, and modules is the latest ES6 modules. And there are a couple of rules you need to follow if you are going through ES modules, and I'll show them as we go. Okay, now let me keep this open. Install Express as a dependency. Okay, so I'll be using yarn add, or you can do npm i2, and I'll install Express. And you can see a log file is being generated, and under dependencies, Express is being added for us. Now we're having our console log over here. To run that file, we'll just do node server or node server.js, and that'll be running. This is how you run files in using Node.js on your local system. Now, to create a basic Express app, I'll have to first import it, and to import it, I'll use this Express, and I'll create a basic Express app, and I'll call that as app. I'll initialize it this way, and I'll need a port to listen for requests, and let me hardcode that port as 5001, and you can see app listening on 5001. So this is the callback function that will be handled when we are listening on that port over here. And when we run this using node on port 501, not API todos, not already. You can see cannot get slash because you have not mentioned any routes over here to listen to. So how do you listen to routes? Okay, or how do you establish routes? Whenever you're visiting a website or when you're refetching or refreshing your tab, that means you're sending a get request, that is the HTTP verb, to that URL over there or that route over there. So you'll be using app.get over here, and you need to specify the route over which you want to listen to. So that will be the slash. Slash means just the nothing after our port number. Okay, so the IP address colon and then we have our port number, and after that this 501. So I'll be listening to slash, and it will be having a callback function too, which will be taking the request and response objects. So what are these request and response objects? As of now, let me send hello world, and when I refresh over here, we can't see that. And why can't we see that? Because I'll have to restart my server because I've changed the code over here, node server, and when I do this, you can see hello world over here. So the request object is everything that you can be passing to that URL over here. For example, this is the route, right? So whatever you're passing into it, be it the ID or a parameter or headers or anything, will be captured inside the request object, and anything you want to respond to that request will be inside the response object. So these both will be given back to us for our route handlers. Okay, so after the get or post, this is a HTTP verb get. You can also do a post over here or put patch, many verbs that are possible over here. And if I'm not using anything, I'll be using a underscore over there because it's unnecessary. We can respond with some text over here like this, or we can use send file to send static files like HTML or markup or anything. You can send your markdown files, anything. And also you can send in some status codes, HTTP status codes like error 404 or 201, 200 OK, anything. And you can also send some JSON data, which we'll be doing, which is what we'll be doing in this tutorial. Okay, so the callback function over here, this is known as the route handler or the controller, and this is known as the route. Okay, for this route, if at all our browser or the client is hitting this route in the request, then this is the callback function that should be executed, and that is known as the controller function. This is the basic setup of an Express app, and this is the basic hello world program that you see when you're dealing with Express. You have seen if I made any changes to our code over here, then I'll have to keep restarting the server, and for that I'll be using a dev dependency. For that, the -D flag. Okay, I've installed Express like this because it is a dependency, and the difference between dependencies and dev dependencies is that even after building our files into static assets, or even after hosting our sites, like when the node environment is in a production, not in development, then the dependencies over here will be useful in the code that is running, even in the production environments. But when we are just developing in our local machine, and for example, the formatters or linters or the task runners, those will be mostly used as development dependencies, because while your app is actually running in the provider, for example, Heroku or something, that will be a production environment, and there you don't need that. So those will be the dependencies that will be only needed inside the development node environment. So nodemon is one such development dependency, and I'll be doing that. Yarn add -d nodemon, and you can see it will be added to development dependencies over here. Cool. Now, what is the benefit of doing so? I can run my app, my server file, using nodemon this time and not node, and you can see app listening to 511, it's the same. But when I just do that, it's okay. And for example, I decided to change this code like this, and when I save, you can see it is restarting due to changes, and when I refresh, you see that exclamation mark is gone. So we don't need to keep restarting if you're having nodemon. Yeah, that is how we use nodemon as a development dependency, and we don't need to keep doing this too, because we are having npm scripts. Okay, let me create a start script, which is what we use in production environments. So it will be node server, and I'll be having a dev script which will be inside the development environment, and for that I'll be using nodemon. So instead of typing these in the terminal and running the file and making a terminal stay in the same directory as this server.js file is, instead I can create scripts, and I can use yarn start or yarn def or npm run start or npm run def, and they'll run it. Okay, so, and there is even a better approach. In Visual Studio Code, you have npm scripts over here. I can click on this nodemon server and it will run that task for us. Okay, so you see that app started on 5.1, and this is how we can use NPM scripts over here. Now let me introduce you to some environment variables, because I just don't want to, for example, I also want to show you app running in development mode, listening on port 5.1. Okay, and I just don't want to hard code it, the node environment or the port that we are running in over here. For that, we'll be creating a .env file. Oops. Okay, and it will be having some essential information like our port, and mostly environment variables are some secrets like your database connection strings and all of them. So, and these are not to be pushed to Git. Okay, and even you can also hard code the nodeenv, and I'll set that to development as of now, and before pushing it we can set it to production. Okay, before we are done with developing our app and we want to push it to GitHub or Heroku and all, then we'll have to set that to production. Okay, or else our app will be running in development mode. Okay, so how do I make my Express app know that I'm using some environment variables and I want to embed them into this over here? And for that we have the very beautiful .env package, and that will be using as a dependency .env. I'll also install cross-env and I'll let you know what's the use of that. First, let me explain how .env works and all before starting our app or anything. I want to use I'll extract the variables that I've used over here, like nodeenv from process.env. Okay, so process.env, if at all you know any basics of Node.js, all the environment variables and all of them can be accessed using the process.env. So env is a property of the process object, and env itself is an object, so it will be having some key value pairs like property, port, nodeenv, and these are all the environment variables we will be having access to, and we can use those in our app here, like port, since we have destructured that from over here, and I can use template strings. I can put that and this, and you can see my console log changed from normal strings to template tags. And I think for that we have an extension in VSCode, some template, I'll have to check, template string converter. And what this will do is, as soon as you introduce the dollar bracket over here, it will convert our codes to backticks. Okay, that is quite handy at times. Okay, and I can embed nodeenv over here. Cool. And by the way, I'm using ES snippets as my extension, JavaScript ES code snippets. That is how I'm using the console log statements and all of them pretty quickly. Okay, so this is how we can use environment variables, but there is an issue. When you try to run this, you can't, you see that undefined, and your port is hard coded, and when you really try to go to 5.1, it won't work because the environment variables are defined over here, and we are trying to access them from here, but they don't know the connection between this file and this file. And for that, I'll be importing .env from .env, and I'll call .env.config. Okay, so that's a method on the .env object, and always remember the .env config should be above extracting our required variables. Okay, always this should be above this. If we are doing that after extracting our variables or before using those variables in our code, if you're doing that in the last line or something, it won't work. Okay, so in order to have a connection between these both files, we'll have to use this config object or the config method before extracting our variables or using those variables anywhere in the code. You don't need to extract like this. You can use directly like process.env.port over here or process.env.nodeenv over here. Okay, I just like to destructure my variables this way so that they'll come in handy when I use them multiple times. This config object takes in a root property as far as I remember. Yeah, the path property. Okay, and this will be a string. And since we are having the .env file in the same directory as the package.json is existing, you don't need to specify this. But if at all we are having our .env file, or it doesn't need to be a .env file, it can be any name, but the extension should be .env. It can be config.env or demo.env, anything can do. If at all we are having that in other directory other than the directory in which package.json is residing, then we have issues. Then I'll have to specify that path property to exactly the file pointing to the path of this .env file. Okay, cool. So since they are in the same directory, I don't need to do that. Now when I try to do the dev script, you can see it will be running in development mode. Our environment variables that we are setting over here are coming into play. Okay, that's cool. And when I try to close that and run it in production mode, yeah, it is not in production mode because we are not using cross-env in our npm scripts. As you already know, I've installed the cross-env npm package, but I'm not using it over here. To use that, I'll be using like this cross-env, and I can explicitly set my environment variables over here. Since it's a start script, it will be in production, and I should copy that, come here, paste that, and I'll go to development. Now, without using cross-env, you can also explicitly set your environment variables like this before running your npm scripts, but those will be only applied inside the npm scripts that we are using and not inside the code. To actually extract the variables from npm scripts itself and not from an env file, then you'll have to use this cross-env package. Okay, so the cross-env package lets you use the same environment variables that you've declared in the scripts. You can use them in the code without mentioning this nodeenv and everything inside over here. So I can just delete it over here because I'm explicitly setting my environment variable as I am running the script, and it will be using the same environment variable here too. Now you can see, let me remodel this over here. So let me write server up and running in nodeenv mode and is listening for requests on HTTP localhost and the port, and for that I'll be using the environment variable again. Okay, and a slash over here. Okay, so that's it. I'll be listening on this port over here, and as a callback function, I'm just logging it to the console, and I'm mentioning the complete URL over here, and I can also see the environment, the node environment in which the app is running. Okay, so this is express app, initialization, and this is a basic route which I'll be deleting in a few minutes, and this will be listen for requests. Cool. Okay, now let us run our script in development mode, and you can see it will be server up and running in development mode and is listening for requests at localhost 5001. When I alt and click on that, because VSCode can do that, you can see it opens directly for that. Okay, now I'll just stop the script and I'll open it and I'll run the start script now, which runs in production mode, and you can see server up and running in production mode, and this is running via node. That is why you can't see those yellow things and all, and it runs on the same port, and you can see our app is now running in production mode. Okay, now I also want to add some logging to my app, so I'll be using Morgan as my logger, and I can use Morgan as a middleware to my Express app. I'll be explaining what middleware is and everything, and I'll be using only logging when I'm in development mode. So since I won't be using it in production, I'll be installing Morgan as a development dependency or a dev dependency. Okay, cool. You can see in package.json Morgan is added. Now how do I use Morgan? I'll have to first import it, Morgan from Morgan, and after initializing our, here we can add middlewares after initializing our Express app. So app.use will be using Morgan and we'll be running it inside in dev mode. But since I want to use this only in development mode, I'll first write a conditional and then use it. Okay, if the node environment is in production development, only then use the Morgan logging, or else don't use it. Okay, so what is Morgan? Morgan is a logger that will be logging inside your console as you make requests and all of them. So the routes and the HTTP status codes, everything will be logged to the console, and I'll be showing you that. Okay, just in a moment. Now let me run my dev script, and you can see Morgan will be run along with nodemon. When I click on my app, since as I've mentioned, when we are visiting a website or when we are refreshing a website, we are hitting this route, and that is called as a get request, because we'll be requesting for data from our API. And you can see Morgan is already logging for us from there. So a get request for the /URL, and this is the HTTP status code, it is the time that took and everything. So everything will be logging for us. But in production mode, it won't be running because I've added the conditional over here. If I run it in production mode, you can see Morgan is not listening for requests or anything over here, and it won't be logging stuff for us. What are these request and response objects? For example, here I'm having a send method over here. I can also send files like this, or I can send status codes, okay, like status over here, or I can also send JSON. Okay, for example, let me send in a JavaScript object, name equals to TSC, which is TheSkinnyCoder, by the way. Okay, let me run that first. Development mode, let me run that. We come here, reload, and you can see the JSON data being sent as a response to our endpoint. Okay, when we are hitting this, if I mention API / todos, for example, when I come here and refresh, you see there is no route attached to that the plain / over here. That is why it is unable to do that. But if I go to API and todos / you can see name TSC now, because for this route over here, we're attaching this controller function or this request handler. Okay, so that is how we'll be using the basic routing, and the request object will be having whatever we type in. Okay, for example, if I mention the /id, this colon, if at all we are mentioning any colon in our route over here, that means we are passing in a variable to our route. Okay, now how do I access that route, or how do I access that variable? Let me just do a rest.send as of now, and inside the request object, which I'll have to mention because I'll be using it now, request.params.id, because id is the name that we are passing in over here after the colon. That will be the variable that we will be passing after the URL at the end. Now that is a parameter to that URL or that route, right? So it will be accessible from the request object's params dictionary, and you'll be having that ID over here. Now you can refresh and you can't see that, but if at all I pass in 1, you can see 1 being printed to me because I'm sending the same request that you're passing in over here. Okay, so that is how we can use the request object. As we dive deep into this tutorial, we'll be also seeing how to set HTTP headers and everything using the request object and all. Okay, cool. So this is how the request and response objects work, and some properties and parts of these are the send method, send file, or params, or headers and body. There is a lot to learn. Okay, now what are middlewares? So middleware is, we've already used that. If at all we are using our Express Apps instance and we are doing a use and we are passing in any function, that means that function is having access to the request and response objects. Okay, now these middleware functions will be able to manipulate these request and response objects. That is why Morgan is able to track our request object over here, and it is going to track the URL of our route, and that it is going to print over there, and it is also saying what request are we sending to that URL using the request object, using the headers and all, and it will be also showing our that get request or anything over here. Okay, like this, and even the status codes and all. So since Morgan is a middleware, it is able to access the request and response objects. This is a third-party middleware we are using. We can also use custom middlewares. We can create our own logo, and we can add that as a middleware to our Express app, and it will keep tracking our request and response objects and do whatever we want. Okay, but the scope of this tutorial is beyond that, and I won't be dealing with custom middlewares in this tutorial. Now that you know middlewares and Express and all of that, let me shift the topic completely and let me turn you towards MongoDB Atlas. Now we can start for free or log in and everything. I'll just sign in. Okay, and I think I have 3 Google accounts and I'll be logging in with the one in which I am not having a cluster. Okay, so there are, I think, as I've counted, there are 5 steps to create a cloud database. So MongoDB is, by the way, it's a NoSQL database. That means there is no tables and there is no structure, there is no schema. You can also create a schema to your documents. Okay, so in SQL databases, you'll be having your data in the form of tables, and there'll be a schema, and it'll have to strictly follow that schema, and you'll be having properties like foreign keys and all of them. And whereas coming to a NoSQL database, it is like a school with no rules. You have no schema, nothing. You can create simply almost looking JSON like documents, and you can have a cluster over here. So the first step is signing in or creating a free account over here in cloud.mongodb.com. So MongoDB on the cloud is known as MongoDB Atlas. Okay, so this is system. You don't need to have MongoDB installed on your system. Atlas will be holding that instance of MongoDB in it, in the servers, and you can create your own database on the cloud. Okay, so all your data that you're creating over here using your REST API will be stored in here. Let us first build a cluster, and I'll create a free cluster. Unless and until your dad is filthy rich, you want to go to the other ones. And I think I'll be sticking to the basics except for this. Okay, I'll be using the name as REST API, and we can use that. I'll create the cluster. Okay, so cluster is like it holds some users and some databases and some security options. Everything hold it into a single entity is known as a cluster, and it takes hell lot of a time to complete this. Now, without wasting time, I want to show you how to create a database user, and for that we'll have to go to security and database access, and we'll have database users, and we can add a new database user. Okay, let me create the user as, how do I name this? The SkinnyCoder. Copy that, paste it, show. Okay, I think add user. Okay, that's good. So the first step is building a cluster. The second is adding a database user. The third is whitelist your IP address. That is such a racist term. Okay, we'll have to go to network access, because you're having your database over here, you're having super users, everything, but how do you actually use this Express app over here and use your controllers of these routes and add data to your database? For that, you'll have to access the IP whitelist or the IP address whitelist. So as of now, our IP address whitelist will be having the localhost address that we are having, but after coming into production and all, we'll have to change that. So I'll add an IP address over here. We can add the current IP address or allow access from anywhere. I advise you to use the current IP address, but I'll be doing this access from anywhere, so you can access from anywhere. Okay, and confirm. But you won't do that in general until and unless you are testing and you are the only user. If at all you're having multiple users, then you have to discuss and take the decision. Now, we don't need to load some sample data. We don't need that. We'll be creating our own data. Now let us get into connection. Okay, and here I'll go to connect, and I think our cluster should be first created for that, and only then we can connect. Okay, I think that's done. So let's get to connect over here, and we can connect our application. Okay, so NodeJS, you can create your backend APIs or REST APIs using many languages, but NodeJS, and yeah, 3.6 or later. And this is what we want to copy, and I'll be placing it in my environment variable, because you don't want to share this with anyone. That will be a hell lot of risk. And the password is the same. Oopsie, wait, don't do that. It's the same as this. Okay, and the database name, I think I can just mention a name over here like this. Let me name this as todos. Okay, so the name of the database will be todosdb, or I don't know if I can have hyphens. I'll just do that as todosdb like that. Okay, so todosdb is the name of the database. You'll have to change that. You'll have to add your password over here after the colon, and the username will be over here. Okay, You can also create your database from here, within here. Okay, I think we'll have to go to that REST API over here, and I'll go to collections over here, and I can add my own data, and I can create an own database, and I think I've named it as todos db, and let me name that as todos. Okay, I actually don't need to do this because we'll be using mongoose as our ODM, and that itself will do this for us, but it's okay, not a problem, we'll do that. And as of now, our todos collection will be empty. Query results are 0. We are not having any documents. Okay, so a document is like a simple JSON object which will be having key value properties. MongoDB is a NoSQL database, so it will be not having any rows and columns, and the cell is the exact match of the row and column. It is in the form of properties which will be having a couple of keys in key value pairs. It is very similar to JSON or JavaScript objects. So this is our MongoDB URI, and this is the main reason you want to push your .env file into gitignore, and you don't want to push it to git. Cool. Now that you know our database is set up and you're having access to that in our environment variable, let me create a config directory, and in that I'll create a file called connectdb.js. I'll first have to add mongoose as my dependency. Okay, mongoose, and mongoose is just a object data mapping library, and what it does is it has got a very beautiful level of abstraction embedded in it. It will use its intelligent methods, and it enables us to access these databases on the cloud and all of them. And we can also use the models that we'll be able to create, and we can define schemas for our models, and we can perform operations on those database models like the find method or anything. We'll be getting into that later. As of now, we'll be using mongoose to connect to our cloud database, and for that I'll have to import mongoose. Okay, and I'll export our default function, an asynchronous function, because the connect function inside mongoose is an asynchronous function, and you'll have to use async await over here. You can also use promises and .thens and all, but I don't want to do that. I'll just do a try catch, and what if I have an error? I'll just log it and stop the process with 1. If we are doing process.exit with a parameter of 1, that means we are stopping a server with a boolean of 1. Okay, so how do I connect to my cloud database? For that, we have a method called connect inside mongoose, and this takes in the MongoDB URI as the first parameter, that is a URI, and we know that URI is in process.env.mongo_URI. okay, and there is an issue with MongoDB, and there are there are many properties that you'll have to set to trues and false, or else you'll be having some security issues and all. I think I'll be providing a link in the description below for what is the need of providing these options over here. I myself have to explore this actually, and I'll set that to true and use find and modify to false, and we have that. Now this connect function returns us a connection variable, so I can capture that inside a con variable over here, or you can name it anything. And what I'll do is I'll log a safety statement that okay, we are connected to the MongoDB database. MongoDB database, and I'll use the connection variable over here. Con dot, we have a connection property in that, and we have the name of our database, and that will be printed to the console, that will be logged to the console. Let me recap. Exporting a unnamed asynchronous function, and we are connecting our MongoDB database for the required URL over there, and there are a couple of properties we need to mention for MongoDB or the mongoose to not raise any errors for us. And I don't know why this came in over here, that shouldn't be there. Okay, so and we are logging and making sure that we are connected to the database, and if at all we are having an errors, we are doing that since we are using async await. And I think I'll have to await this connect method, because this returns a promise. I think the connection, yes, this returns a promise, so we'll have to await that. Since we are using async await, I'll have to use try catch blocks, do exception handling. Okay, now since we are having access to that, I'll just import from /config/connectdb.js. and now this is what I mentioned. When you are using this ES6 modules without TypeScript or any other extra features, and just using the type equals to module over here. The issue is you'll have to mention the file format over here, connectdb.js. But when you're using Babel or TypeScript, you don't need to do that. So we'll have to remember that. Okay. Now what I'll do is, before initializing my app, I'll connect to the database. Okay, so connect DB, since we have that is a function and that is coming from that config connect DB thing over here. We have imported it. So these are the third-party imports, and I always make it as a practice to have a space between those both. These are the imports from our file system over here. I'll close this. I'll just restart my terminal. I don't need to, but I'll just do that because I think we have I've made changes to the environment variables. It's a good practice to restart. Now you see server up and running in development mode, and it is listening to requests, and then it is connected to the MongoDB database, and the name of the database is todosdb. Everything is fine. That the above console log statement is coming from here, and I think I misspelled this. Okay, and the below console log statement is coming from here. Okay, if at all there is an error, it comes over here. Now the issue is I don't want to access my server or my server to run if at all there is an issue in my MongoDB database. And even though I'm mentioning my connectdb function before initializing the app itself, forget about listening for requests, but even before initializing the Express app, I'm connecting to the database, but still the log statement in here is being executed after the listening of port, and that is because that is an asynchronous function. The connectdb function is an asynchronous function, and I'll be using the beautiful concept of IIFEs, or immediately invoked function expressions in JavaScript, and I'll be using an asynchronous IIFE. Okay, so this is a arrow function, and I'm calling itself like this over here. Okay, so it's an unnamed function, and everything under this I'll be shifting into that function. And when I save, by the way, I'm using Prettier as my code formatter. You can see that over here. So Prettier code formatter, and I also have save on format enabled. Okay, if I disable that, whenever I save, the code won't be formatted. Since I have enabled it, whenever I'm saving, the code will be formatted. Okay, now you see in an asynchronous function, in an async IIFE, I'm wrapping the connectdb function and then doing this. Now see the magic. When I run this, first it will be connected to the database, and only then our listening thing. What the fuck? Okay, yeah, I'll have to wait this because that's an asynchronous task, and I'll have to wait that. And now you can see the database connection is established, and then we are doing this. Now what is the use of this? If at all there is a secure connection, then this log statement will be done, and we'll come here and we'll create our Express app instance, and we'll add its middleware routes and all. Then we'll listen for requests. But if at all we are having an issue, that error will be logged and will be exiting out of the process, and that is why the process will be stopped here itself, and we won't be creating an instance of our Express app, or we won't be keep listening for our requests and all. So that is why our API will be secure, and even if you are not having database connection, we'll be getting a server error and all if the client is trying to access our server. So it's a good practice to always wrap your application inside asynchronous IIFEs. Okay, be it anything. If at all you're having asynchronous connection functions for your databases, and I think it's very common to do this even with any ORM you're using, or ODM, be it Mongoose, SQLized type ORM, anything, we always try to do that. Let us create our first model, and now from here on things starts getting scary. ToDo.js, and I'm creating that inside a folder called model. By the way, if you don't know how I did that, I'll do a file, I'll add src, and I put a slash, and I do demo.js, and that will create a source folder and then a demo.js, which I don't want now. I'll just delete that. Okay, so models. What are database models? So database models are just the form of data that you want to store in your API, or you want your API to serve from your endpoints and all. Okay, so this API is all about to-dos. Okay, it's a to-do REST API. So it will be having a model called to-do. Even for creating though this is a NoSQL database, we'll be creating a schema. Okay, mongoose, and not only mongoose will help us create database connections with our MongoDB Atlas and all, but we can also create database schemas for our MongoDB and also create mongoose models, and we can export them, and we can enable the methods for finding and doing all the CRUD operations using the mongoose models. So first let me create our to-do schema, and that will be mongoose.schema, and it will take an object as data. Now every to-do I like to have two properties, at least three actually, including the ID. It is always a good practice to have an ID field in all of them, in all of your mongoose models, in any model, in any entity that you want to represent in your REST APIs. It is always a good practice to have IDs, but MongoDB itself comes default. Even though you're not defining a property of ID, MongoDB ships in with a default _ID property, and I'll be showing that in a minute. And you can use string over here, and I also want to have a boolean which just sees if the to-do is completed or not. For example, our to-dos like go to the market and all of them. Okay, so it's a boolean, by the way, not a false. Okay, this is a schema, but at times I want this to be a required field, and I want a default value for this and all of them, and then we want to mention this in a property or a key value properties type. Okay, so the type will be of the string, and required will be true. So this will make the text field of the type of string, and it will be required to true. And I can also pass in an error message in over here, but I won't be confusing you with complex details. And the type of this will be boolean, and instead of having a required, I'll mention a default, because every to-do, if you're adding it to your to-do list, that means you didn't complete it, right? If you have completed it, why would you add to a to-do list? So by default it will be having a value of false, so it is not completed. Later on we can do update operations on this to-do REST API, and you can convert the completed field to toggle that completed field from false to true, and that will be our update operation I'll be showing. Now let me default export default export mongoose model this time, mongoose.model, and always remember the schema is capital S over here, but model is small m, and I want to name it as to-dos. So the name of the models is to-dos, but I named this to-do. That's fine, I'll just do to-do over here. And a mongoose model takes in the name of it, what we want to name our model in the database, and that will be to-do, and the schema on which we want to create this model, and that is the schema of this one over here, so that will be to-do schema, and that's it. And we are default exporting it. We are having access to that to-do model, which is our MongoDB model. Okay, and we'll have we don't need to explicitly provide the ID field as a primary key for our schema, because MongoDB itself, when creating a new thing, it will be creating that ID field for us. Now let us get into the most important part, which is MVC. Okay, if you don't know, MVC, which stands for Model View Controller. We won't be dealing with views, because if at all we want to deal with views, this won't be an API, it will be a backend framework or something. Okay, I know Express we can create, we can use templating languages like Nunjax or EJS or Handlebars, and we can purely implement MVC, but at least I'll be showing how to use models, routes and controllers in this tutorial. Okay, so let me give you a brief about MVC so that you'll understand what the heck I'm talking about from now on. Whatever I did over here, you see app.use, that is called as a middleware. Okay, so not only are the functions, but you can also attach routes to your Express app instance. Okay, this is a basic route that I've been showing you, and I can also create another route over here for get request. So it will be maybe /API, I think it should be wrapped. Okay, /API just to-dos. Okay, not the ID thing, just to-dos. And even this will be having request and response objects. As I've told you, the callback function is always known as the controller function, and it can have a res.send. Okay, it will be hello world. We're having two of these now. Okay, let me open this, click here, slash API todos, and you see that. And if I do 51 or my favorite number 69, you get 69 over there. You see our routes being maintained in the same file as our server.js, and having controller functions too in the same file over here. That gets quite tardy, right? So there is this cute approach called as MVC. I don't know if this comes under MVC or not, but I like this approach where we use the Express router to create a basic route for our Express app, and we'll be attaching all the routes, and whatever methods are possible on that route, we'll be chaining our methods over there, and we'll be exporting that router, and we'll use that router as a middleware to our Express app. I know you'll be like, what? Because now I'll be showing you that and you'll be understanding it. Now let me create our routes folder, and I'll create our todos route, not todos route, maybe todo routes.js. Okay, so inside this routes folder, I'm having a todo routes thing. Now the first thing that you want to do is to import Express. Okay, and we'll be creating a router. Okay, Express ships in with a default router of itself. Okay, R with a capital. Okay, now the same things that you have been doing on your Express app instance, like the .get method or .use or anything, is also possible on this router, because it's very similar to the Express app instance. The router is very similar to that, but there is a, for example, I can do the get method here too. Okay, and I can be like slash API slash todos over here. Okay, and let me just, why not do this, right? Just cut these from here, I don't need them there, and I'll paste them over here, slash API, and okay, so these are what we are having, and I'll have to not express export default router. Okay, I'm exporting that router. Now I'll be importing that router over here, imp dot slash routes slash todo routes.js. I don't know why this doesn't come. Okay, and I'll be calling it as todo routes, and after adding middlewares and all, what I'll be doing is I'll be forwarding routes to routes from slash API slash todos to the todo controllers. And what am I doing exactly here is I'm using my Express router that I've been that I've imported over here, and I'll attach all my todo routes over here. Okay, so whenever we are having a request over here, okay, yeah, actually I forgot this, and this should be router, because we have created the router variable over here, and it should be router.get and router.get over here. Okay, so these are the basic things that we have. And now this is known as route forwarding. Okay, so let me open this. For example, your base URL is this. Okay, this is your base URL, and whenever you're trying to access anything after this, we'll be starting with a slash. Okay, so what exactly I'm doing here is anything that is matching with the slash or anything after that slash, like this slash, and after that localhost 5,001 that will be forwarded to the todo routes. And todo routes is actually this. By the way, I did that using Control Alt and click on Windows, and I think you'll have to do Command click on Mac. And okay, we come to this todo routes over here, and we are initializing a route express route over here, and adding these variables and adding the controller functions for these routes over here. Now, since I've forwarded over here, now that route will be continuing from here. Now if I go to API todos, you get hello world, only because API todos is matching this controller function over here. Since all of these are having the API todos and API todos over here, I can cut that part to over here, API todos. Okay, and whatever comes after that will be here. Okay, so we are basically slicing our routes, half over there, half over here, So everything that is matching /API/todos will be attached to our to-do routes, which will be this. And after /API/todos, if at all we are having an ID, this controller function will be executed. And if it or not we are not having an ID, and if it's just the same thing as this, so a slash means that you cannot leave this empty like this, okay? You'll have to mention a slash, and then we'll be getting this, okay? It's the same, there is no difference. Now when I refresh, you see the same, but when I go to 69, this is 69, okay? Cool. Now this, hence this is known as route forwarding, and this over here, this guy is known as the primary route hitter, because every route that is hitting in your client, the primary route hitter is this over here, okay? Only after this it will be going to the secondary routes, which will be inside our router. Now what is the use of splitting our routes like this? For example, it is not only the to-dos that you want to serve, but maybe you want to serve the different users that you are storing in your database. Now you'll be having user routes over here, and you'll be having controllers for them, and maybe you are storing those users in /API/users, and you want to forward every URL that is having /API/users to those user routes and not to-do routes, okay? So that our server.js file will be looking clean and all, okay? And you will have a nice structure in your application where you can see /API/todos will be going to to-dos routes, and the very similar users thing will be going to user routes and all of them, okay? So this is the primary route hitter, and we are forwarding this to here. Now, as I've already been mentioning, these are known as routes, and these callback functions are known as controllers. Now we can have these controllers in their own folder, okay? It's like India, people keep dividing the states like anything. To do controllers.js, okay? Inside a folder called controllers, I'm having to do controllers. Now before doing that, let me structure our API very nicely. And another thing that I want to show you is not only, for example, if the URL is slash, okay, and not only get request, even a post request is possible over here, then that will be a lot of duplication to do so, right? For example, you don't want to do this and just add a post request over here and do whatever you want with the request and response objects over here. So the function you can do according to the request that you're getting and everything, it doesn't matter, but you see a lot of code is being repeated. So what we actually do over here when we are dealing with Express Router is we use this route method, and we specify the route, and we keep chaining the methods that we have. For example, on the slash method or the slash route, we have a get method that is possible, and even a post method is possible. A post method stands for creating operation, and when we are having a router.route of /id, and you see when we are using a route method, there is no controller function over here, but we'll have to chain our methods and provide the controller function as parameters to these methods over here, which I'll be showing in a second. And to get a to do by ID, this is the get method, and to get all to dos, this is the get method. And also the patch request is possible. You can also use a put request for updating. So patch and put both serves the updating operation inside our 4 CRUD operations, and even delete is done, but I'll be sticking with patch, okay? So yeah, as of now these are not having any controller functions, okay? Do you see that request handlers, as I've mentioned, request handler or controller functions, everything is the same. Now let me create my first controller function. I'll be exporting some functions over here, okay? Not default exports, okay? I don't want default exports because I'm exporting many of them. Export default get all to dos, okay? And this will be an asynchronous function, and you might be asking, why the heck are you again using asynchronous? We are bored of that shit, but I'll have to use it because we want to use our to-do model, okay, which is inside models /todo.js, okay? To do, I named it to do, and we'll have to use that. So the to do model enables us to use some, so it is almost like an object which is having some properties or methods embedded in it, and we can use those methods to get all the data or the documents that you're having or storing inside your MongoDB Atlas, okay? Now let me show you some magic. Now what we're going to do is to do dot and you can see find one, find by ID, remove. All the CRUD operations are possible over here, and just doing a find will return all the to-dos that are stored in our database. And since this is an asynchronous operation, I'll have to use a wait, and since we are using a wait over here, I'll have to wrap it with async. It returns all the documents to us, so I'll be capturing them in a variable called all to-dos. Okay, so all to-dos will be a documents array. Okay, so each to-do is a document in our MongoDB database, as I've already been telling you. To-do will be the name of the collection, or which is very analogous to a table in a SQL database. Collections are very analogous to tables in SQL database, and documents are very analogous to rows or row data inside our SQL databases. Okay, and whatever we are having over here, these fields and all, these will be the columns in our SQL databases that we'll be creating initially when we are defining a schema. It's very similar. Mongoose does that for all. And by the way, Mongoose, the creator of Mongoose, I forgot his name, he's the same person who coined the term MERN stack. Okay, now what we can do is, since the controller functions, as I've already been mentioning, let me close that. Now we can add our controller functions over here, and they will be having access to our request and response objects. I can use the same rest.json method. Okay, and I'll pass this all to dos over here. Okay, that's it. So as a recap, I'm importing our model over here. This is the controller. I'm finding all the, you see that, find all the documents, every document that is available, because I'm not passing in any parameters, so that's the default behavior. And since it returns a promise for us, it returns promise for us, document query actually returns promise, so I'll have to await it. And since I'm awaiting it, I'm using async over here, and I'm capturing all those inside a variable called all to dos, and you can see it is a document array, and I'm returning that with the same name. I can actually JSON, as I've told you, it will be all to dos, but since we are using ES6, if the name of the property and the key, if the name of the key and the value in the property are same, then I can just pass a name like this, and that will end up the same way. Okay, now I can attach that route over here. So get all to dos, and you see VSCode did that auto completion for me, but it doesn't include the .js extension over there, which is very annoying. Maybe I'll do a pull request. Okay, so we're having get, and we're doing that. Let us go to our route 501 API / to-dos. When I do that, you see all to-dos, and that's an empty array. And you can see in our VSCode, we are getting that get request to /API to, and 200 is just a green response. That means it's 200 okay. That means the operation is being successful, and it doesn't tell us if the data is being sent or not. Actually, the data is being sent, but it's an empty array as of now. Okay, now get requests are fine, because the browser can handle get requests by using the parameters and headers and everything. But when it comes to post and put and update and delete requests, it comes very messy. And for that, what I'll do is I'll create a test / todo tests.js. Okay, and I'll be using the REST client, which is embedded in VSCode. Okay, you can use Postman or Insomnia or anything, but I'll be using REST client. I have recently become a very hot favorite of this. Oh wait, not here. Inside our what did I do, man? Not to do tests or JS. It should be to do test.http or to do tests or REST. Okay, I use HTTP. You can also use to do test.rest. Okay, FV root URL will be http :localhost. So I'm just declaring a variable because it will be handy to access. Okay, /API / to-dos. That will be actually to-dos. Get all to-dos. Just a comment, and if at all you're specifying 3 colons over three hash symbols or 3 bangs over here, that means you're creating a new request. And if I do get and I do the auto completion thing for me, I can use root and control space, and it provides that for me. Okay, now I can click on here, and you can see all to-dos. It's responding to me, very similar to what. And you can also see my Morgan being logging over here, assuming that this is the client. So REST client mimics that browser environment or that Postman environment over here. In order to access a to-do by ID, first we'll have to have an ID for our to-do. So let me create a to-do, create to do, and that will be an asynchronous function too, and it will have the request and response objects. I'm not naming it as underscore because I'll be using the request object over here. So what I'd be doing is, let me just show you first. Okay, to do dot create, we have a method called create, and it takes in an object as parameter. And what is the model that we are having? We are having text and is completed, so we can just do that over here. Okay, so text will be, for example, visit the store, and is completed I don't need to mention because there is a default value for that. Okay, so it creates text for us, but we are hard coding our data over here, right? And we don't want to do that. We want our controller function or our route handler to take care of that. And how do we pass this data actually? So this data is actually being passed to us in the form of JSON from the browser, and to enable our server to accept those things, we'll have to actually add a couple of middlewares. So app.use, no templates, app.use, and I'll be using the embedded express.json middleware. Okay, so this accepts JSON parsing and everything. And I also want to use URL encoded because whatever the data that we'll be sending, that will be actually mimicking, or will be actually sending from front-end forms. That can be static HTML pages or React or anything, but we'll be sending from HTML forms. And when we are passing data from HTML forms, we want to use this middleware called URL encoder. Previously, the JSON used to be there in another package known as Body-Parser, but now it's embedded into Express. You don't need to do that. And we can set extended to false or true. We don't need to know actually what this extended property is. It's just that we use these both for passing the body that we are sending, or this, whatever the data that we want to store to the REST API, and not from all the GET requests. You see, all the GET requests will be sending data as JSON responses for us, but when we are using create methods or delete and put and all, we'll be accepting data from the REST API or from the client, and according to that we'll be making changes in the controllers. And in order to access that data and in order to parse it, because JSON is just a language that we use to transfer our data, we'll have to use these both middlewares. Okay, URL encoder, it just returns a middleware that parses URL encoded bodies, and it checks our content type headers and all of them. And this extended property can be set to false or true, because the parsing will be done using the query string library. If it is set to false, and QS library it is set to true. There is hardly any difference between query string and QS libraries. I'll leave a link in the description below regarding the differences between QS and query string. It's a Stack Overflow answer I read recently. Okay, now that we added those important middleware, set my status, HTTP status, to 201, and 201 stands for OK created. Okay, 200. If at all I'm not specifying a status like this, that means it's by default 200, and that is what you see over here. Okay, but when we are creating something, when a document or data or something is being created from a REST API, then it is a good practice to set the status explicitly to 201 or 201, and then I can chain these methods, the JSON method over here. Okay, now what is it that I want to send? And since the create method returns as a promise or a new document, so I can call it as a new to-do, and I'll have to await this because that's a promise, and I'll be sending that new to-do back. Actually, it can be on one line. I don't want to confuse you. Cool. Now I'm setting the status, HTTP status. I assume you know HTTP statuses and verbs, CRUD operations at all, as I've already mentioned them in the prerequisites. So the status over here, and we are sending this JSON property back. Whatever I do inside my HTTP tests, it's a good practice to, not a good practice, I think you'll have to have two empty lines between each request. So create a new to do, and it will be a post request. We have that. I'll use the root URL, and the header, I don't want to pass in any header and no content. Since I'm not passing in any content, I don't need to set any header. And when I do that, I got an error. Yeah, because we can't do that because I've exported this, but I've not added that to my post route over here. We'll have to attach our request handlers or the controller functions. Okay, I think let's create to do. I named it wrong somewhere over here. Okay, very good. Now let us make sure, yeah, that's running. Let me create that, and you can see the underscore ID that's being added to us explicitly, and that will be almost looking like a UUID. If at all you don't know what a UUID is, it's a quite long string type of ID, unique one. Now is completed is by default false, though I'm not explicitly creating that over here and doing that, but there is no point in creating the same value over here while we are dealing with a REST API, right? We want to take the data from the client and do that, and when we want to accept the data from the client, that is why we used these two middlewares over here. And how do we get the data from the client? And we get the data from the client inside the request object. Okay, so the request object, first let me log the request dot body. Okay, because inside the body we'll be sending in data that we are having. Okay, now let us just forget that you're having that, and I won't be having any JSON method. Just we'll send the status of 201, that's all. Okay, now let me come to tests, and I'll have to provide a content type of application JSON because I'm sending in JSON, and I'll have to leave an empty line, and I'll have to send my JSON input to this. So I want to send text equals to make a RESTful API tut. Okay, that's it. And when I do that, you see the body that I'm sending is being sent to us over here, and since I'm not stopping that, I cancel it like that. Okay, so we can see the body is being printed to that over here, and that is the exact thing that we are doing over here inside the create thing, right? So what I'll do is I'll uncomment this, and instead of explicitly creating an object over here, I'll just use request.body. Okay, so whatever we are passing in, that will be sent back, or created a resource and then sent back. Okay, and I'll have to pass, oops, no, need to do for us. Okay, and I don't want any logging like this, so we are creating a new to do, and I'll have to await this. Okay, I'm using whatever we are sending inside that over here, and it creates a new to do for us. And the create is actually an abstracted method. We have a save method that will be using. I'll be showing that in a minute. Now I've created it. It returns a new document, a newly built fresh MongoDB to do doc to us, and I'll be sending that in response to our JSON over here. Now you can see if I come here and if I refresh, there'll be already two documents inside our to-dos. Okay, we don't have anything, but we have in to-dos. Yeah, we do in to-dos, because this is actually what is created while we are dealing with mongoose. But this is what I've done when I've initially created that annoying thing prop. Okay, we have to-dos, and you can see visit the store over here. If I come here and send a request, you can see a new to-do is being added, and that is being sent to us as a response, and it is having these completed property, the ID, text, and all of them. And if I just refresh it, you can see two documents now. Yeah, two documents now, RESTful API tut and a visit the store. Very good, and I'm going to delete them. Okay, so we handle all the routes that you are having on the slash thing, but now as if how do we access the parameter that we're having? I've already mentioned this to you. By the way, it's a very good practice to have the method name and the API route name over here. Okay, I actually consider this a very good practice, and it will be post. it's a post request. Okay, we have post, and now we'll have a get request to /API /todos and a colon ID, and that means we are passing in an ID of that particular to do, because every to do is having an ID which we won't be creating over here. MongoDB does that for us. And let me create an asynchronous arrow function, and I'll name it as get to by ID, and it will be an asynchronous function. It will be having access to the request and response objects. It's fairly simple. Excuse me. Now we have the to do model dot find by ID method. Okay, we can use that, and as I've already shown you, we can use the request dot params dot ID. Okay, if at all this is not the name you are using over here, if at all the name that you're using over here is X, then you'll have to mention it as X over here. Okay, but it makes sense to have ID over here, so we'll be doing that. Okay, request.params.id, and it will find a to do which is having that ID. Since ID is the premier key, we'll be using that. Okay, and it's an asynchronous function, and it will return us a required to do, or the to do that we want. Okay, now the issue is, if at all we are passing an ID which no to do in our database or in our collection is having, no document in our collection is having that particular ID, then this will be a nullish value, or a false-ish, or how do you call that? I don't remember. FALSY value. We'll be having a FALSY value, and we want to check that every time we do that. Okay, if at all we are not having that, then I want to set the status to 404, because 404 error, you know what it does, and I want to send in an error back, no to do found. Okay, but if at all we are having no issues with that, or then I want to send the required to do. Okay, so if at all there is no required to do, or if the value of this is falsy, and it will be falsy if there is no document in our collection with that particular ID that we are passing in, then we want to set the status to 404, and we want to explicitly send a JSON response saying that you got an error and the error is no to do found. But if at all we are having that required to do, and that will be coming into else case, and we'll be sending that required to do back. Okay, now under to do routes, I can come here, and this is the get request that we are making to this route and not this one. Okay, so I'll have to make get to do by ID. Okay, and even that will be auto imported for us. Cool. Get to do by ID. Now let me again come to my tester over here, get a to do by ID, and I'll make a basic get request root URL, and I'll also create a new variable over here known as ID. As of now, I won't use anything, and it's good practice to have slashes at the end of your URLs. I always practice that. I don't know if it's really a good practice or not, but okay, ID, and you want to do that. Now you want to set this variable over here to something, because you will be getting an error if that's undefined. I'll show that too. Okay, now get all the to dos. You're not having anything, by the way. Okay, let me create a new to do. Okay, created a new to do, and we are having get all to dos, and you see an array is being returned to us, and we are having this ID over here. I can copy that and paste that in over here in my ID variable, and when I do, okay, what's happening? Okay, as I've told you, it should be having 3 banks, and only then we get that send request button over here, and when I click on that, you see only that to do is being sent, and it's not an array like the previous one, it's just a document, and is completed. The ID, the name is make a RESTful Tut. What if I make go to the store over here and send a request, and a new thing is being returned, and when I get all to dos, you see an array of 2 documents, or a collection of 2 documents, both having the is completed set to default false with 2 different IDs and 2 different texts, and when I do this I get only the first one. But if I change my ID and place it here with the ID that of the second one, which is go to the store, and I do that, I get go to the store. Okay, what if I'm having passing in an ID that is not available? I change that large digit to something else and I'm doing that, and now you get that error having no ToDo found. If at all you're not handling that, then your application crashes. Okay, so error handling is very, very, very important. Okay, you can't escape error handling. Cool. So we are done with 3 routes. We still have 2 required, one to update and one to delete. I think we'll first first we'll deal with deletion, and then we'll slowly get into updation, because deletion is very quite simple. This is a delete request to /API /todos, and an ID will be passed, because you can also create a bulk delete request where it deletes all the todos and you can map it to /todos itself. But as far as this tutorial is concerned, I'm not mad, I won't do that. Okay, delete todo by ID is the name, and it's an asynchronous function. It takes in request and response objects, and it's quite simple actually. You don't need to do anything. The true thing has got a delete method, as far as I remember. Yeah, it has got a find by ID and delete method. So it finds it. If it is present, then it will delete, or else it will return a falsy value similar to this required to do. So you'll have to check that falsy value, and according to that behave that. So the same way, since we are having ID in our route, params.id, I can access that variable that we are passing using that params object in our request object. And since this is an asynchronous task, I'll have a wait over here, and I'll name it as deleted to do. I'll capture the document deleted to do over here. So deleted to do is a document, but at times it can be a false value too, because if at all we are passing of ID which no document in our collection is holding, then it can't find the ID itself. Forget about deleting in the first place, it can't find it, so it will return a false value for that. And I think I'll just copy these down here. Okay, so but I'll have to rename this. Okay, no to do found. Else I don't want to return the whole to do, because there is no use of returning the whole to do, because while you're mostly dealing with front end and all, we'll be using the primary key, which is ID, and only you need the ID to be returned. And what we do is we'll be having some global or component level state or anything. You can have caches if you are using React query or something, whatever. I'm not talking about a specific framework. You can have a single page application or anything. Now you'll be having some sort of state that will be holding your application or the documents that you're fetching. In order to delete it, you just need the ID and you don't need everything. Okay, so I'll be using the deleted to do dot ID. Okay, now you might be wondering, this is returning that underscore ID, but why am I using ID? But this is a abstraction level, a beautiful level of abstraction that is being provided by Mongoose. So I can just do ID, and it's a string version of documents underscore ID. Okay, I don't need to explicitly provide underscore ID over there. Mongoose does that for us. So if at all we are not having that, then it will send no to the found. But if at all we are having that, that will be deleted from the database, and we'll be returning the ID of the deleted to do. Again, I'll have to create a test for this. I'll come here, 2 spaces, 3 banks, delete to do by ID. You don't need to comment your code like this, these comments over here, these comments over here, but I want to make more readable. So I'll having a delete request to root control space root URL /ID control space. Okay, you get that. Cool. So it's a delete request. And now, by the way, these are HTTP headers. I think I forgot to mention while using the post request. So HTTP headers, I assume you have studied about them because I have mentioned it in the prerequisites. So what is the content that you're going to provide in the body you're passing in? this is the body, the request object's body that you're passing in. You'll have to provide the data type of it, and that is the type of the content that you're passing in, and that will be a JSON thing. So application JSON is the format or the format of the data that you're passing in. It will be having application XML and many formats. You can use any format to send your data in, and you'll have to pass that thing over here using the appropriate libraries. By default, these mongoose methods, they'll be using JavaScript objects, and JSON is nothing but an abstracted level of JavaScript object, so we don't need to do anything over here. Okay, now let me send, let me first see what I'm having. I'm having 2 documents, and I think I'm matching to this go to the store thing. Let me get that. Yeah, no to the phone. Why? Yeah, I actually changed this from 7 to 8 in the previous request. Yeah, so yeah, I have go to the store. Now if I do delete request, I'm having an error again because I forgot to chain it over here. Okay, delete to do by ID. Now let's come to the tests, do that again. It's getting quite long. Okay, the deleted to-dos ID is being returned to us. That means it's a success. And when I do this, you see only that. When you do that, you see no to-do found, because that ID is no more existing in our database. We have deleted that. Okay, so yes, even our delete functionality is completed. The only thing that we are having is update. So you can have multiple update operations according to how you want to structure your API, but the only update operation that I want to do for at least our models, which is todos, is the completed value. So mostly I'm planning to make a React or a Svelte, anything using a front-end framework. I'll be using this API to make asynchronous calls and display the database. So it'll be a complete full stack app like a MERN stack or anything. And in there, whenever I'm representing these to-dos in my front end, I'll be having a completed button or a tick button and a trash icon or a delete icon. So whenever I click on the delete icon, this route will be handled, this route will be called, and the delete request will be happening. I'll be using fetch API or Axios or anything. And if at all I'm using that tick button over there, when I click that, then I want a scroll mark anything or anything. Okay, it doesn't matter. I don't want to get into details now. But yeah, that is what we'll be doing mostly in all the applications when we are dealing with CRUD operations. Now, this is update to do by ID, and this is an asynchronous operation. We have access to request and response objects. Okay. Now, oh god, this is very similar to this. I'll just copy and do that over there. And now, this I'm gonna call it as required to do. Okay, and I'll just find by ID. Okay, first I'll find by ID, and then if at all we are having it, if at all the value is falsy, then we can't do anything. But if it is not falsy, that means I don't want to send the same thing. That it is very similar to this request. I want to update the values that we are having in this required to do. So how do I update it? And to update it, I'll have to do required to do dot the thing that you want to update, which is completed, equals to the opposite of that boolean value, which is the same thing. Okay, very cool. So I'm just setting it to false if it is a true, and if it's a true if it is a false. Okay, I'm just toggling that boolean value. Now you made changes to this extracted document that you're storing in this function's local scope, which is required to do, and whenever the function execution is done, this required to do is vanished. So whatever changes make over here won't be mimicked or be shown in your MongoDB cloud. In order to make that happen, you'll have to use a save method, which saves your document to the database according to the primary key. Okay, the save method saves this document by inserting a new document if the document is still new. But since this is not new, because we have made some changes and extracted this from using the find by ID, we won't be having any issues. it will be updating it. Okay, so this is a way of updating it. We can also update by using find by ID, and I think there are methods to find by ID and update and all, but they are quite complex. I don't want to confuse you guys, because it's a simple toggling of boolean, and we won't be passing in any headers and body. We can do that for put and patch requests, but I won't be doing this. By the way, the difference between put and patch requests is, in a patch request, for example, there is the to do model. In a patch request, you can update only this field or update only this field. That is possible, but while you're dealing with put requests, all the fields in your mongoose model should be updated. Okay, and if at all you're not passing any value for this, and if you are only passing only the value for this, and it will be a hell lot of a problem, and either of them will be set to undefined or all. At least you'll have to handle so that it avoids the default behavior, and I don't want that to be a headache to me now. Okay, now I'll make that update request, and before I again forget that, let me add that to update to do by ID. Okay, update to do by ID, and that will be a root URL /ID and again slash, and I don't want to provide anything over here, because put and patch requests, as I've already told you, you can send in data, but I won't be sending in over here, because it's just toggling of a boolean. You don't want to send true and you want to set it to true, and you want to set it to false and set it to false like this. You can just toggle it this way using the plain JavaScript. You don't want to send in any data. It's very unnecessary. If at all you're having a form or in a blog post or something, and if that is your API, then you'll have to send in the new body that you entered in the form. Okay, and that form data should be added to that body or the title field of our model and all. Okay, so that is how you structure your APIs according to your needs. Okay, and there isn't any specific one method to create APIs. You can follow million tutorials, and there will be million ways, and each of them will be in their own special ways. So it's you'll have to keep practicing and finding the way that you are comfortable in. Okay, now when I patch this, you get error no to do found, because there is only one to do, and I've not updated the ID over here. I'll update that, and when I do get to do by ID, I got that RESTful API. Currently the default values being used is completed equals to false, but if I do that, you see we are returning the complete thing, and we are returning is completed equal to this, and when I get all to do's, you see is completed is set to that. Okay, and I think you're seeing the logger being logging many things to us over here. Okay, when there was an issue, you saw 404 being explicitly returned for us, and that is coming over here. If there is, that's a falsy value, because there is no to do ID. You're setting it to 404, and we are doing no to do found. Okay, so that's it. I think that's pretty much it for this tutorial, and I'll just refresh and show you. I'm gonna delete this database. Don't worry, you can't hack into my stuff. I'm not dumb. Okay, cool. Let me stop my server. Okay, so we are having a cute, nice looking to-dos RESTful API. Okay, so it is having endpoints. You've learned about routing, route forwarding, primary route headers, and express middleways, controllers, a tiny bit of MVC. Actually, MVC stands for model view controller. We are having models over here and controllers over here, and controllers will be added to our routes over here. That's an addition. That's programming practice. We create a controller function separately, and we attach them to the routes. And we'll also be having a views folder where we'll be having templates, HTML templates, or any templating languages like EJS or everything. That is the complete MVC. But since I'm creating a RESTful API and not a complete website, and I don't need any front end for this, I just need an interface, and so the name API, which stands for Application Programming Interface. It will be providing the data resources for us, and we can access them from the clients, and the clients can be of any form, which is like a Vue.js application or a React.js application or anything. Okay, or even a plain HTML JavaScript front end. Before I continue, I want to show you that we'll have to add a gitignore if at all you want to push this to get. you'll have to add your node modules, because no one is gonna push their node modules and even their environment files. A star over here in get means anything ending with an environment over here, and star slash means node modules inside any folder won't be pushed to get and over here. Now when I do git init, you can see I've initialized an empty git repository, and you can see my .env file being excluded, the color difference over there, from git, so that now if at all I'm trying to publish this to Heroku or something, I'll have to explicitly set these environment variables inside our Heroku platform itself, and our application will be running. Okay, so we can start it in production too, node server, and you see this. Cool, that's it guys. Thank you for, if at all you made it till here. I should say you're patient, because I'm a slow teacher, I know. Thank you for listening to me for hours, and I hope you extracted some knowledge from this tutorial. And I'll be back with a front-end framework, maybe with React. I'll be interacting with this REST API that I've created.